I do want to move on to Johnny Harris. Are you familiar with this person?
Johnny Harris
was most known for his show called Borders.
He used to work at Vox.
Let me bring in Johnny Harris.
Johnny made a video titled
"Nukes are waste solution in South China.
Why People Blame America for the War in Ukraine."
Johnny's video does more harm than good.
Let's watch The Rise of Joe Rogan by Johnny Harris.
These research skills should be seriously questioned.
What kind of fucking research are you doing, Johnny? Like, unironically, journalistic malpractice.
Johnny Harris is a journalist, filmmaker, and YouTuber with over 6 million subscribers.
I'm a YouTuber. I'm an independent journalist.
In the past decade, he has quickly risen to become one of the most recognizable faces of independent journalism, producing videos that cover hot-button issues, conspiracy theories, and
Can I get an ice cream cone?
why the McDonald's ice cream machines are always broken. His success as a journalist who operates primarily through the online medium is very significant, as limited credibility has been afforded to those who don't work with traditional media. And Harris's contributions have received kudos from many for bringing independent journalism to a mainstream audience. But over the years, a few cracks have begun to appear in his facade, particularly for those who feel his commentary is more style over substance.
The stylized representation and/or presentation can cloud the journalistic integrity that he claims to have.
If you know enough about Johnny Harris, you probably know that he's not entirely uncontroversial. In fact, his content in the last few years has been met with pushback by multiple creators, many of whom specialize in areas that Harris apparently doesn't.
The problem with Johnny Harris is that he sounds like he knows what he's talking about until he talks about something you know about.
Most content paints his misinformation as a result of ignorance and poor research. In fact, this seems to be a prevailing narrative when it comes to explaining these persistent shortcomings from Harris. But one question remains. If his errors are the result of misguided and haphazard research, why the fuck does it keep happening? At the start of December 2024, Johnny Harris uploaded a video titled "How the US Created the New Cold War," which he then retitled "Why People Blame America for the War in Ukraine." Unfortunately, the title wasn't the only issue with this upload, and many people pointed out the flaws in his sourcing and narratives, which in hindsight seem even more tone-deaf given the current political climate surrounding the conflict. In less than a couple days, the video was removed, and Harris posted a now-deleted update explaining that he was very grateful that as a professional journalist, he could rely on internet sleuths to do his homework for him.
I love that I can put something out there and that I can hear from you, a group of people who come back with good faith debunks, critiques, and feedback for me to make me better at what I do, to wake me up to blind spots I might have in my perspective.
Either way, he stated that he'd heard the feedback and was going to do better, committing to posting a more thorough and balanced video that explored all angles of the relationship between Russia and NATO.
So I still want to publish this video, but I just want to do it right.
Now, I think he should probably know better as someone whose job it is to investigate the truth, but I have no interest in revisiting this video because he deleted it. And plenty of people with more experience in these affairs have critiqued his content more eloquently than I ever could. I'm not a historian or economist or political scientist or really anything that important. I just put nice visuals on the screen to distract you from the fact that we're all gonna die. But as of writing, my sensory organs are intact, and it doesn't take any of the aforementioned occupations to notice that Johnny Harris has not yet followed through on his promise to create a better version of his former video. But if that was all, I wouldn't care. Man's gonna take his time. However, when you commit to making better content, I believe that's a promise you commit to on all fronts. And his next video, why Saudi Arabia is building a $1 trillion city in the desert, is not just a misguided or ignorant upload like much of his former controversial content. It's an intentionally one-sided puff piece for a nation that is committing atrocities. Most people have overlooked this because it doesn't receive the media coverage that many other issues do. And this video undoubtedly looks fantastic. But strip away that veneer and you find a deeply ugly narrative at the core of an otherwise beautiful video. So, what's it about?
I know what you're thinking. Why does the world need Neom?
That's a good question.
The world needs Neom because the world needs change.
For anyone who may be out of the loop, Saudi Arabia has begun development on a planned city by the name of Neom. It features extremely futuristic and ambitious designs, and plans to energize Saudi Arabia's tourism industry in the way that Dubai has done for the United Arab Emirates. Sounds cool, right? Well, unfortunately, even the planning phase has been beset by multiple concerns relating to its feasibility and the ethical sacrifices that are being made to achieve this vision. Anybody with a vague interest in this subject will know of these concerns, and Johnny Harris is no exception. In fact, at a cursory glance, the video seems to be tackling the relationship between nomadic tribes in this area and looking at how the construction might affect their existence.
I asked Salim to bring me out into the desert, not only to get up close on the construction of Neom, but also to show me how people live out here, to introduce me to members of his tribe, how they've survived for centuries. Nomadic Bedouin, who represent the origin story of this desert kingdom. I wanted to put a human face to this collision of worlds.
Yet this is actually barely explored at all, and his interactions with the tribe are often merely used as a backdrop for the coverage of the construction underway, and one that he sets a clear thesis statement for at the start of the video.
I've been hearing about all the reasons it can't work, how this is all just a mirage of royal ambitions. And yet, even from space, you can see that they're building it. They're building something.
Johnny Harris here seems to believe we need an angle exploring the potential of this whole city project working out, but we already have that angle, which is the one from the Saudi government.
They say in a lot of projects that happen in Saudi Arabia, it can be done. This is very ambitious. They can't keep saying that, and we can keep proving them wrong. So since we have empty place and we want to have a place for 10 million people, then let's think from scratch.
It goes without saying, the Saudi government is a deeply biased source, and maybe we do deserve more angles. But is there an unbiased angle that can actually look at this development as a positive thing? Well, if there is, Harris doesn't prove its existence.
The Saudi desert is proving to be exceptionally peaceful, despite the army of trucks that, by the way, are still working here in the dead of night. They don't ever stop, and haven't for years.
After spending a night in the desert while in awe at the fact that construction teams work around the clock, I guess American infrastructure really is that bad, he moves into this narrative tackling the individual cities that make up this large project, being Oxagon, which will be an industrial center, Sindalar, which a hitchhiker claims to Johnny is
finished like 99%,
and Magna, which takes its name from an already existing town in the coastal region by the name of Magna. Magna is a cluster of 12 planned resorts, something that Johnny clarifies shortly after. It cannot be understated that Magna is a large proportion of the actual project, which makes what's being discussed next even more pertinent.
Which is actually the name of one of these coastal villages we've just been driving next to that is no longer a village. They've forcibly relocated thousands of people for this project.
Here, Johnny Harris provides one of the most important pieces of information relating to the Saudi government's policy in pursuing Neom. They have been forcibly moving native tribes to make way for these constructions. Although there isn't really too much information on the town of Magna specifically, it has been widely reported that people have been evicted and homes demolished for the construction of the resorts, with Amnesty International even releasing a statement on Saudi Arabia's widespread human rights abuse. What will Johnny have to say to this? Not even a wow? Just sitting there with your mouth agape and shaking your head? I'll be honest here, I don't need someone telling me that forced displacement is bad. He could have given no response or reaction whatsoever and it would have been fine, but this very much has reading Mein Kampf energy. He's walking up to the line of trying to indicate to his audience that he's a good guy without actually providing any substance. After explaining Magna, we then cut out of the video, where he feels the need to clarify that these shots are just 3D renders because
it looks so real.
Like, really? Some of these shots look alright, but others are so clearly rendered that it's not fooling anyone. But I think he just wanted to transition into plugging his new channel. After doing that and pretending that he uses rocket money, he returns to explaining Saudi Arabia's other projects with the sense of majesty it deserves, before topping off with this absolute cherry of a fact.
Oh, and by the way, that's the mountain where Moses talked to God and got the 10 Commandments like a few thousand years ago.
Except, this isn't really true. The location of Mount Sinai has been a subject of debate for ages, and it's likely that we will never know for certain where it is due to the sources being so historic. However, Johnny Harris does acknowledge this in a note at the base of the footage. I guess it wasn't important enough for a cutaway like when he needed to glaze Saudi Arabia's VFX team, but at least he leaves a little note that clarifies his position. Hold on. In the bottom line here, he says that the theory is garnering popularity amongst contemporary biblical literalists, explorers, and certain historians. Except he doesn't back this up at all. When you go to his references for this piece of information, he's attached an article that argues that Mount Sinai is definitely not in Saudi Arabia, but links a single picture that accredits it as a primary candidate. But it also acknowledges that most of the advocacy for this theory comes not from scholars, but from filmmakers and enthusiasts. Maybe they could be considered explorers, but that's about all the leeway you're receiving with this one, Johnny. I think this is really important to harp on, because Saudi Arabia would love to claim the location of Mount Sinai to bring in a ton of religious tourism. The truth is that they have seemingly inspired a lot of filmmakers to support this theory. But the article that Johnny Harris links in his references states that actually a Sinai Peninsula site for Mount Sinai is still by far the most viable theory, and references a scholarly source that has clearly looked into this more than myself or Harris. It also states that there are multiple issues with the Jabal al-Lawz theory, evidence that it's commonly confused with Jabal Makla, a mountain that is actually 7 kilometers south of Jabal al-Lawz, and much more resembles the burnt mountain that God supposedly torched, and that the split rock is on the wrong side of the mountain, and that the petroglyphs are not unique enough to serve as any evidence, alongside many others you can read for yourself if you're really interested. If you want the really dumbed down stuff,
the 3 people listed on Wikipedia as original proponents of this theory are Bob Cornick, who says he uses God's word to guide him to archaeological sites, Ron Wyatt, who is known for claiming he found a piece of Noah's Ark, the 10 Commandments, and Jesus Christ's blood, amongst many other things, all claims which have been unproven or deemed false, and Leonard Moller, whose book The Exodus Case is based on the work of Ron Wyatt. None of these people are archaeologists, and their work has been criticized by archaeologists and biblical scholars alike.
Now, I'm not religious and I'm not a biblical scholar, so people can believe whatever they wish to believe when it comes to the location of Mount Sinai. But did Johnny Harris read the article he referenced?
It's not supportive of what he said or what he clarified.
Did he read anything before parroting a talking point that sounds like it came directly from the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Tourism? If you're going to claim that educated sources are beginning to support that theory, you should at least leave an article that supports this from a contemporary scholar. I'm sure they exist. Instead, you link the first result that appears when you put in Jebel al-Lawz into Google News. I want to say that one is a coincidence, but however you found that link, it's still supremely complacent and lazy that you couldn't be bothered to find a reference that actually argues for what you said. That's not journalism. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Johnny's covering the Line, probably the most notable and ambitious project within Neom. The Line is a planned city that will exist entirely within a contained cuboid structure that resembles a giant line in the sand. Its design means that it will be the first zero-carbon city. It will run off entirely green energy and will house up to 9 million people. In spite of its forward-thinking objective, it's also probably the most controversial project, given that much of the displacement of Saudi natives has been blamed on the development of this city.
He doesn't really discuss any of this. In fact, he takes a break from all the gawking to once again prove that he's different to the other girls.
So much of the reporting on Neom has been focused on how implausible, expensive, and delusional this project is. And that's all well and good if that's what you want to focus on, but to me that's not that interesting. What I'm most interested in understanding is why.
This is all well and good, until you actually read 3 of the 4 articles that Harris very smugly references as framing these projects as implausible, expensive, and delusional. And you read what they're talking about, which includes the displacement of tribespeople, the dangerous and deadly working conditions, and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist shining a light on the malpractice of the Saudi government. Johnny Harris, by his own admission, isn't that interested in that stuff. He's interested in whether a big line in the sand can be built. Not only is it incredibly disrespectful to your fellow journalists to dismiss their legitimate human rights concerns as not that interesting, but it also shows how little you care to read beyond the title. And if you do care to read, how little you care. After that absolutely unhinged statement, we cut back to Johnny hanging out with his Salt of the Earth pals and cooking up some food. Which is lovely, but we're gonna skip this bit to the point where he's actually introduced to a Bedouin tribe who are not too far from the line. Now, this is where we could actually have an interesting conversation about the implications of this project on local tribes. In this moment, it's really fascinating to see how this group of nomadic people live. Johnny Harris talks about history. I have some issues here, but honestly they're trivial compared to what's coming up next. So I'll summarize and say, Harris concludes on the notion that Saudi Arabia has developed greatly as a nation in many places, but still has deep connections to its Bedouin culture.
The kingdom rapidly modernized, all while still maintaining a deep connection with Islamic law and the rules and norms of Bedouin life. And despite this rapid modernization, hundreds of thousands of people still maintain the nomadic lifestyle.
This would be a great point to transition into the question of how these new developments contradict the culture and history, and how it has impacted these people's lives. Even on a basic level, a large line in the sand raises serious questions about its compatibility with the nomadic way of life. Johnny doesn't bring this up here, but does, however, approach the subject of Neom with the Bedouin people. And you might think we're actually going to have that alternative narrative. Hell, Johnny Harris actually highlights that there are serious problems with freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia, so the Bedouin can't really be blamed for their subsequent evasive answers.
Can you ask them what their thoughts are on all the building that's happening?
I have to be sensitive here, because I'm reminded where I am. Saudi Arabia isn't a place where citizens, nomads or not, can speak critically about their kingdom.
What we can do is blame Johnny for his shocking takeaway from this brief interaction.
I got nervous looks and vague answers. But one thing is for certain. The Saudi government has been paying and compensating anyone who has been affected by these projects. Out of respect, I decide not to push it.
This is unbelievable ignorance from an Emmy Award-winning journalist. In this context, the first man speaking uses the term inshallah, which means if God wills it. Then the older man speaks up and says that God will compensate us, not them, which very directly contradicts the sentiment that the government are compensating people. How Johnny can leave this conversation with that assurance as an experienced journalist is inconceivable. He decides to not pursue this issue further, out of respect, which is fine if he'd actually had an accurate takeaway from this discussion that actually links back to the topic, but his only reference is this brief comment.
I couldn't help but feel worried for this link to the past.
After this, he talks about why Saudi Arabia is doing this. It doesn't exactly take a genius to tell you that oil is a limited resource, so they need to diversify their revenue streams. It's whatever. I could have told you that in a minute or so, but I digress. He then goes on to talk about the scope of the project again, which is good for him, I guess. And there's this guy who's happy about Neom because he's going to be a tour guide. Everything begins to resemble an ad, and it looks like, honestly, there's not going to be any actual address of the conflict that should be discussed.
I wouldn't do this business without Neom. Before Neom.
Wow.
Everyone wanna check on internet what is Neom. Then they need a tour guide. They have more than 30 tour guides working with me.
Wow.
So it's a big business now, and it's all because of Neom.
But finally he does, and I really wish he didn't.
So while Salam is seeing the benefits of this project, the effects for others in this region are less certain.
In case we forgot that they're being compensated, Johnny is here to remind us.
The people forced to move to make way for the construction of Neom. They were given money to rebuild their lives somewhere else.
The topic of forced evictions and how the Saudi Arabian government has handled it needs to be crystal clear. The Saudi Arabian government has committed a violent and criminal displacement of entire native people who've had no say in their forced relocation. Multiple people have been sentenced to death for resisting relocation. Others have been sentenced to prison for decades. And there are serious allegations of harassment, torture, and kidnapping. Johnny Harris gives these people all but a sentence's recognition. However, he does mention one individual, Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti, who was killed by Saudi authorities after refusing to move. He was one of a few people outspoken on social media who drew light to Saudi Arabia's operations. And although Saudi authorities claim he opened fire on them, this is seriously disputed by witnesses who claim that he was fired upon and only acted in self-defense, others who claim that he didn't even own firearms, and Abdul himself, who stated that Saudi authorities would assassinate him under this guise. This is serious stuff, and at its most charitable, has to be acknowledged from both angles, especially with Saudi Arabia's record on their treatment of human rights and journalistic freedom. And yet Johnny Harris's coverage here is unconscionable.
One even posted to social media voicing his outrage. A risky move in a place where freedom of speech isn't really a thing. Soon, he was locked in a shootout with security forces that left him dead.
To say locked in a shootout that left him dead is a deceptively neutral statement on something where there is no middle ground. How do you think he was left dead, Johnny? This is a narrative colored by Saudi authorities who have already proven themselves capable of far more than lying. And to actually explain how oppressive their regime is, while uncritically presenting this account, which is actually harder to find online than the mainstream angle that depicts the disputed version of events, very clearly can only raise serious questions about Johnny Harris's integrity and neutrality in handling this matter.
At least 47 other villagers were detained on terror-related charges, and 5 of them are now on death row.
In case you were wondering if that's all he had to say on it, it is. And he concludes on ambient music and an inspirational tone.
Lifting this kingdom into the future. That's the calculus here. What's clear is that this kingdom isn't stopping anytime soon.
Well, let's face it, Johnny. If anything was stopping Saudi Arabia, it'd probably disappear at an Istanbul consulate. And with that, it's a wrap on Johnny's video. The description gives thanks to a few people, provides a disclaimer that they used AI in this video. Interesting. Unlike his upload on NATO, a distinct majority of people like this video. Some even say it's his best work, and that concerns me greatly. I don't want to see his worst. If he'd done this in Russia, people would be outraged. Yet it seems a degree of naivete pervades the subject and the country it concerns, which Harris has capitalized on. There's only been one other prominent dissenting voice on this matter, and that's from a YouTuber named Micro, who similarly calls out Harris for not being transparent about the narrative constraints of this video.
According to the organization Reporters Without Borders, independent media are non-existent in Saudi Arabia. All official news goes through the country's Ministry of Media and its subdepartment, the General Authority of Media Regulation. Even on their own website, when translated from Arabic, they admit that their objective is to set controls for media content and regulate the status of those working in the media field. Harris talks frequently about his credentials as an independent journalist, so the fact that this wasn't mentioned or acknowledged is a bit strange, but it is understandable.
Respect to him for speaking out about this, but he's too charitable for Harris, whose content can't be excused as understandable given the circumstances. A creator of his caliber should know better, and even Micro believes he does.
Saudi Arabia has been widely criticized for its use of poorly paid and mistreated migrant workers to do the actual labor on these construction projects. Again, Harris had to have known about these problems, but didn't mention them in the video. As a journalist, he absolutely has a duty to protect his sources, but he could have inserted other voices on this issue that aren't afraid to speak out about a problem that actually is worth it.
This isn't ignorance, this is appeasement, and Johnny Harris is simultaneously misleading his audience into thinking that he's presenting a piece of neutral journalism while placating the Saudi Arabian government so he can actually report from ground zero and nail all these excellent shots. However, it's quasi-journalism. Any criticism is ridiculously softball, and hinges on a distorted version of events that is incredibly disrespectful to the people who have suffered at the hands of the Saudi government. I don't know what exactly is going through Johnny Harris's head, but this, paired with his NATO Russia upload, provides the impression that he's very desperate to present the other side. The hot take. To try and actually illuminate another angle on a subject that has a very clear consensus from most echelons of society, or journalistic society at least. This can only work if you acknowledge the very uncomfortable truths surrounding these scenarios, and the decades, even centuries of history that has preceded it. Unfortunately, Harris is just not good enough to do that job, and back to back, he's demonstrated that. When we talk about his deleted NATO Russia video, the one thing that I'd say in favor of it on premise is that I'm interested to see how other people living in other states perceive the matter on the basis of their media. None of us are immune to what we consume. And Western media obviously has its own perception of affairs, even if that perception might be more accurate than the other. Yet when it comes to Saudi Arabia's Neom project, nobody needs to present a perception that's sympathetic to Saudi Arabia. They have a presence in the media that means they can represent themselves. They spend more than enough time courting investors and conducting interviews about the future of these resorts. They're hosting the 2034 World Cup. The royal family does not need or deserve your help. The citizens, however, the tribespeople, the Bedouin, they don't have an organized press team. They don't have a designated spokesperson. Their advocates are organizations and individuals who have no great self-interest, just the privilege of being able to speak freely on matters that those people don't. When we hear about what's happening to citizens in such oppressive countries, it's often just the tip of the iceberg, because these nations try to exercise control over what the media even knows. When you click on links leading to Abdul Rahim Al-Huwaiti's YouTube uploads, you'll be met with an error screen and the message that this video isn't available anymore. Which is YouTube's way of saying, we removed this video without reason, which also very likely means the Saudi government asked us to remove this content. Saudi Arabia has their voice. Anybody with the platform to speak up against their oppression should. Johnny Harris didn't. I said at the start that I'm no expert in any of the subjects that he's previously been called out for. It's true. Ask me about the history of NATO and I'll probably give a fairly uninspired answer. But the fact is, you don't actually need to be an expert to point out many of the problems that permeate his content, because chances are, he or whoever's working for him has been lazier than you. This video is different though. It's not just laziness, it's active omission and adoption of narratives that could lead to a complete misapprehension of an extremely delicate situation that downplays some terrible things happening to people who can barely speak about it themselves. Johnny walks up to the line of acknowledging many of these injustices, in a way that presents an illusion of journalistic integrity but never actually presents the full picture. In most cases, presenting a whitewashed angle, and even twisting Bedouin words in a way that supports the propagated Saudi case. Some have suggested that he was paid by Saudi Arabia to make this video. This isn't helped by the fact that Johnny has worked previously with large international organization, the World Economic Forum, and received some criticism for it. He did respond to these claims at the time, stating that the WEF did not exert any influence over his content, and that he doesn't think that there's necessarily any conflict of interest in working with organizations. I'm going to afford him the benefit of the doubt on this one, and say that working with an oppressive state would probably yield an even less critical video. It appears the manufactured consent argument that some have made already seems more feasible, but even then, it's not an acceptable excuse for inadequate journalism. It fact, I'd say it's worse than just filming a tourism ad, because whereas one is identifiably biased, this is bias masquerading as neutrality, and it's fooled a lot of people. It's also just not a good look. When you've experienced this exact same criticism before, why would you even consider making content like this? I'm gonna say that Johnny Harris just really wanted to see Neom up close and made some sacrifices. But you can't blame people for thinking he was chasing a bag. At the start of this video, you may have noticed that I say his series Borders was nominated for an Emmy. Despite the fact that most online sources, including Johnny's own website and his video descriptions, said it was nominated for 2 Emmys. I couldn't find any evidence of this second Emmy nomination for that series, so I can't confirm it. What I did find, however, was evidence of a second Emmy nomination for Vox and Johnny Harris for a video made in 2016 titled 2016 Olympics, What Rio Doesn't Want the World to See. It's a video that strips back the sports washing and hype around the Brazilian event, demonstrates the brutal reality for the people who live there, who have been consistently neglected and mistreated by their government.
Over the years, little settlements of a few hundred families have popped up in Baja, and usually workers unable to find affordable housing and creating communities of their own. These places have been around for decades, and many of them have gained legal status for their property. So when the Olympic Park was planned for this area of Rio, it wasn't much of a surprise when the city came in with eminent domain eviction orders, telling these communities that they would be moved to public housing complexes, usually far out of sight of any international visitors.
It shows that Johnny is more than capable of making competent and necessary social commentary when he chooses to, but here, he chose not to, because of the environmental circumstances surrounding this content. Saudi Arabia is a country that has murdered and imprisoned many people for doing what Johnny claims to do. And when Harris's actual ability to perform his job is impacted by the country that he's covering, he's implicitly validating those techniques of oppression. The truth is that regardless of all the nice shots you can take, if you can't make a piece that doesn't succumb to its biases when presenting a story which demands serious degrees of due diligence, then you shouldn't be making that content at all, especially to a 6 million subscriber audience who might well take what you say at face value. Not only are you letting down yourself, your viewers, your story, and the people at the heart of it, you're letting down your profession. And if I made that video, I'd be handing my Emmy back. So next time Johnny stares into the camera, puts on a solemn face and says that he's going to do better, ask yourself, why doesn't he?